2:30 a.m. Security alarm blaring, strange voices in my kitchen, someone else's suitcase in my master bedroom, and that's when I knew my HOA president had completely lost her mind. I'd just pulled into my garage after a red-eye flight from Singapore, 3 days early from my international consulting contract, expecting nothing more exciting than collapsing into my own bed and sleeping off the jet lag. Instead, I found my house occupied like a corporate takeover, lights blazing in every room, and the unmistakable chatter of what sounded like a dinner party happening in my dining room. The scent hit me before I even opened my front door. That aggressive vanilla and jasmine perfume that had been suffocating neighborhood meetings for the past year. The same nauseating cloud that followed Patricia Thornfield around like a toxic aura of self-importance. My HOA president wasn't just making my life miserable with endless citations anymore. She was literally running some kind of business operation out of my house, entertaining clients, and from the sound of things, treating my inherited property like her personal real estate showcase. What would you do if you discovered someone had turned your home into their office while you were traveling internationally? Drop a comment telling me your worst HOA horror story and where you're watching from. Let me rewind and explain how this nightmare began. My name is David, I'm 44, and 8 months ago I inherited something that seemed like a blessing but turned into a legal battleground. A 3,800 square foot Tudor-style mansion in Willowbrook Gardens, one of those gated communities where the grass height is regulated and the neighbors wage war through formal complaint letters. My Uncle Harold had lived in that house for 25 years. He was the type of man who collected vintage cars and kept meticulous records of everything, a habit that would become my salvation later. When he passed, he left me his masterpiece, a house worth $920,000, completely mortgage-free. After my brutal business partnership dissolution had drained my accounts like a financial hurricane, this inheritance felt like finding treasure while drowning in quicksand. Lucky, but terrifying. The house carried the aroma of cedar and leather when I first explored it, mixed with that distinctive smell of quality craftsmanship that only comes from homes built by people who cared about permanence. Every evening I'd hear the gentle hum of those old heating systems warming up, a sound that reminded me I'd finally found stability. But every Eden has its serpent, and mine wore designer scarves, drove a Mercedes, and had the temperament of a meter maid with Napoleon complex. Patricia Thornfield, 49 years old, HOA president for 6 relentless years, luxury real estate broker, and the kind of woman who says property standards like other people say homeland security. She lived in a contemporary townhouse near the community entrance. Stylish enough, but nothing like the historic estates in the premium section where my inheritance had placed me. And that geographical difference seemed to eat at her like acid. The sharp tap of her designer heels on my brick walkway announced her inaugural visit. I was organizing moving boxes when she materialized, tablet clutched like a religious artifact, looking like she'd stepped from a catalog titled Suburban Authority Complex Quarterly. "Welcome to Willowbrook," she said, though her expression had all the warmth of an IRS audit. "I need to discuss your landscaping compliance issues." Apparently, my uncle's classic English garden, the one that had flourished for 2.5 decades, violated the contemporary minimalist aesthetic mandated by the current HOA guidelines. The intricate stonework told stories of decades of careful cultivation, but evidently history doesn't override modern design standards. "The penalty is $200 if you don't modernize within 2 weeks, she announced, savoring each syllable like vintage champagne. "But this garden has been featured in community newsletters for years," I objected. "Past recognition doesn't excuse current violations," she replied, presenting me the citation with the satisfaction of someone who just solved world hunger through bureaucracy. That was merely the opening salvo. Week 3 brought a violation for unauthorized vehicle storage because my consulting equipment trailer was visible from the street. Never mind that it was parked in my own driveway and contained $50,000 worth of specialized technology. The crunch of expensive tires on gravel became a sound I learned to associate with impending harassment, usually followed by the flutter of another citation being tucked under my door handle. Week 8 sparked complaints about my daughter Emma's art camp friends creating excessive pedestrian traffic during her summer visits. "It disrupts the serene residential atmosphere," she explained, as if children enjoying creative activities constituted some form of municipal crisis. Week 15 produced the masterpiece, a threatened fine for operating an unpermitted consulting practice because my cybersecurity work occasionally required client meetings in my home office. The 2 laptops and a whiteboard apparently constituted running an unauthorized commercial enterprise. The pattern was clearer than my uncle's crystal collection. Long-term residents left equipment trailers parked permanently, operated actual businesses from converted garages, and hosted events that required noise ordinances. No citations. But David, the divorced newcomer with the impressive inherited estate, every activity was examined like evidence in a federal investigation. "She feels threatened," my neighbor Carol whispered one afternoon as we collected our mail. Carol was mid-50s, retired educator, with the gentle wisdom of everyone's favorite teacher. Successful newcomers challenge her authority, especially when they inherit properties she covets but can't afford. When I scheduled my month-long international assignment in Southeast Asia, I only informed Carol and Emma. Somehow, Patricia discovered my plans. The evening before my departure, those familiar designer heels announced her approach. "You really shouldn't abandon a property like this unattended," she said, her eyes already cataloging my entryway like a detective planning evidence collection. I could provide professional oversight services. "Thanks, but I have everything arranged," I responded. Her smile could have frozen molten lava. "We'll see about that." 4 weeks later, I returned home at 2:30 a.m. on a Wednesday, 3 days ahead of schedule. The Singapore project had concluded earlier than anticipated, and I was eager to sleep in familiar surroundings. The smell of recycled airplane air still clung to my travel clothes as I dragged my luggage through the familiar garage, already planning a long shower and 14 hours of uninterrupted sleep. That's when I noticed it. A silver Mercedes sedan parked in my guest space. My house was illuminated like a commercial display. Every window radiated light, the outdoor fixtures blazed, and I could detect conversation drifting from what appeared to be my main living area. The rustle of palm fronds in the warm evening breeze seemed unnaturally loud as I approached my own residence, feeling like an intruder observing someone else's existence. I circled around to the side entrance, using muscle memory from Uncle Harold's tutorials to locate the hidden key beneath the decorative planter by the pool gate. Years of visiting during holidays had taught me that sometimes the indirect approach was the wisest strategy. He used to joke that front doors were for announcements, side doors were for family. The initial sensation that overwhelmed me was the aroma. Expensive fragrance saturated the atmosphere like chemical warfare, that same overwhelming floral assault that accompanied Patricia through board meetings. But beneath it lingered something else, the evidence of my own kitchen being commandeered by someone else. Catering containers dominated my marble islands like artifacts of invasion, and I could observe used champagne flutes in my sink. My champagne flutes filled with champagne from my temperature-controlled wine storage. As I navigated through my own residence like a cat burglar, documenting everything with my smartphone, my professional training activated. During my cybersecurity consulting career, I'd assisted corporate lawyers gather digital evidence, and the fundamental rule was always identical. Record everything, assume nothing, and never allow emotion to compromise documentation. I photographed the unfamiliar business materials scattered across my office desk, the different cosmetics arranged in my bathroom, the prescription medications on my vanity counter, heart medication prescribed to P. Thornfield. The sound of running water echoed from the master suite along with what could charitably be described as a business conference call. Someone was conducting what appeared to be a real estate presentation in my bedroom, and they sounded completely at home. I ascended my own staircase, each step producing its familiar symphony until I reached the upper landing. The bedroom door was partially open, warm light spilling out like evidence of trespass. Through the crack, I could observe silhouettes that definitely weren't mine and hear Patricia's voice explaining property features to what sounded like potential buyers. "Patricia," I called out, my voice resonating through the hardwood hallway. The conversation halted like someone had activated a mute button. The discussion stopped immediately. "David," her voice fractured like thin porcelain. "You're not supposed to return for 3 more days. It's my house, Patricia. I can return whenever I choose." She emerged 10 minutes later, carrying a leather portfolio and wearing one of my uncle's vintage robes, the silk one that still carried traces of his cologne. Her styled hair was slightly disheveled as she faced me in my own corridor, looking approximately as guilty as a teenager caught stealing. "I can explain everything," she began, clutching the portfolio defensively. "There was a security concern in the neighborhood. I was protecting your investment as a professional service to the community." I gestured toward the empty champagne bottle on my nightstand, a $300 vintage I'd been saving for a celebration, and the obvious evidence of business meetings being conducted in my bedroom. By consuming my wine collection and running real estate tours through my private residence? Her expression flushed crimson, but she escalated her defense harder than a politician during scandal season. "I have HOA emergency management authority over unoccupied properties during community security situations. It's completely within legal parameters. Produce the documentation." She marched to my home office, like she owned the deed, retrieving a folder I'd never encountered before. Inside was a professional-looking document titled Emergency Property Management Authorization, dated 2 days after my departure, complete with what appeared to be my signature granting her temporary administrative oversight. This is where my background in digital forensics became invaluable. I'd spent years analyzing fraudulent documents for Fortune 500 clients, and this signature had more warning signs than a hazardous materials facility. The pressure points were wrong, the character spacing was inconsistent, and the D in David had a loop I'd never created in my entire life. Fascinating forgery, I said, activating my phone's recording function. But document authentication is literally my professional specialty. That's when a door closed in my guest suite, and my evening transformed from surreal to completely unhinged. Out walked Detective Michael Brennan in civilian clothes but carrying his service badge. Not just any law enforcement officer, but the married father of 4 who lived in the adjacent neighborhood and coached youth soccer during weekends. The same Michael who'd always seemed like an honorable guy at community gatherings. "Everything secure here, Patricia?" Michael asked, his hand positioned casually near his concealed weapon like this was a routine security check. The puzzle pieces assembled with the sound of a bank vault ceiling. This wasn't simple trespassing. It was organized fraud with law enforcement collaboration. Patricia hadn't just been squatting in my residence, she'd been operating some kind of sophisticated scheme with police protection. "Michael," I said, maintaining my composure, "you understand you're in my house without authorization, correct? Off-duty, but carrying official identification with a woman who's been illegally occupying this property while I was overseas." Michael's confidence evaporated like steam. "She said you granted permission for property management services. Did I authorize you to be here?" Silence expanded between us like a growing chasm. "Because this entire interaction is being recorded," I continued, displaying my smartphone, "and I suspect your department maintains strict policies about officers involving themselves in civil disputes, particularly when fraud might be involved." Patricia's complexion had shifted from red to the color of aged cheese. "You cannot prove any illegal activity occurred here." "Actually, I can." I smiled for the first time since discovering this invasion. The following morning, I awakened in my reclaimed bedroom for the first time in 4 weeks, though awakened overstates it. I'd barely achieved sleep. Every sound in the house made me question whether Patricia had duplicated my keys. The first call I made was to a security company. The second was to begin investigating exactly how extensive this conspiracy had become. While waiting for the lock replacement service, I examined my violated home like a forensic investigator. The garage revealed its own narrative. My tools had been utilized and returned to incorrect positions. Fresh tire marks on the concrete where they'd parked additional vehicles, and my workstation had been converted into what resembled a staging area for property improvement projects. Not my property improvements. My neighbor Carol knocked around mid-morning, bringing homemade soup and wearing the expression of someone carrying significant intelligence. "I wondered when you'd discover the situation," she said, settling into my kitchen chair like she was about to reveal classified information. "Patricia told the entire community you were subletting to her temporarily, claimed you needed the rental income after your business partnership failed. The violation felt both personal and financial simultaneously. She hadn't just stolen my space, she'd stolen my reputation and dignity. She hosted a business networking event here last Tuesday," Carol continued. 12 people, professional catering, used your entertaining spaces like she was showcasing her own listing. I assumed it was legitimate, but she had explanations for everything. That's when I discovered my security system had been professionally bypassed, not amateur cutting or destructive tampering. Someone had disabled the sensors with the type of expertise that requires serious technical knowledge. I'd installed that system myself after my partnership dissolution, partially for security and partially because working with technology helped me process stress. Seeing it expertly compromised felt like discovering surgical scars you didn't remember receiving. By afternoon, Patricia had launched her first counterattack. An official HOA summons appeared at my door, requiring my presence at an emergency board session that evening. 48 hours notice, technically compliant with our regulations, though barely. The accusations read like a prosecutor's dream: disrupting community peace, harassment of elected officials, and my personal favorite, aggressive behavior toward community leadership. The session was conducted in the clubhouse, a beige box that smelled like industrial carpeting and unfulfilled promises. 5 board members occupied a folding table that appeared more suitable for a church bake sale than a judicial hearing. Patricia presided from the central position, wearing a charcoal suit that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent. The outcome was predetermined before I entered the room. 3 board members were current or former clients of Patricia's real estate business, something I learned during my post-confrontation investigation. The 4th was her brother-in-law, Kenneth, who possessed the analytical capabilities of decorative furniture. Only retired Professor Elizabeth Hartwell seemed capable of independent reasoning, and she appeared uncomfortable with the entire proceeding. "David," Patricia began, her voice oozing manufactured sympathy, "we've received concerning reports about your conduct last evening. Multiple witnesses describe you as hostile and intimidating." Multiple witnesses. I surveyed the room and counted exactly 0 individuals who'd been present in my house during the confrontation. "I'd like to hear from these witnesses," I requested. "Detective Brennan has submitted a comprehensive report documenting your unstable behavior," she replied, sliding papers across the table. Michael's account portrayed me as an erratic property owner who'd burst into my own residence and made threatening declarations toward a community volunteer who was safeguarding the property during the owner's international absence. The creative fiction was remarkable. He'd somehow made breaking and entering sound like community service. They allocated me 5 minutes to defend myself against their judicial theater, 5 minutes to explain why discovering someone operating a business from my house without permission had made me hostile. "I'd like to review the board records that authorize this emergency management program," I said. Patricia shuffled papers like she was performing card tricks. "That's an administrative procedure. I'd also like to examine the HOA regulation that grants you authority to occupy member properties." More paper manipulation. "The board maintains comprehensive emergency authorities. Could you reference the specific regulation number?" The silence extended longer than a corporate merger meeting. Finally, brother-in-law Kenneth contributed his wisdom. "We don't need to validate our authority to you." That's when I understood this wasn't about regulations or authority. It was about control, pure and simple. My background in corporate consulting had demonstrated that most bullies depend on their victims being too intimidated or too uninformed to resist. They rely on people not understanding their rights or not having the resources to defend them. The vote was 4-1 to assess me $2,000 for harassment of community leadership. Elizabeth was the solitary dissenter. Bless her integrity. They also imposed a $750 monthly oversight fee until I demonstrated compliance with community expectations, whatever that meant. As I departed the meeting, Elizabeth intercepted me in the parking lot. The evening air carried the fragrance of jasmine from someone's garden, a scent that should have been pleasant but felt ominous. "She's executed this strategy before," Elizabeth whispered, glancing around like we were coordinating an escape. "The vacant property scheme. Previous victims relocated rather than challenge her. The elderly woman's revelation hit me like icy rain, but it also provided something I hadn't possessed before, confirmation that this was more extensive than just my situation. The following Tuesday, I entered the law office of Jennifer Walsh, attorney at law, carrying a storage box full of evidence and a determination that probably registered on seismic equipment. Jennifer specialized in property rights and HOA abuse litigation, something I discovered exists in depressing abundance. Her office carried the aroma of mahogany and competence with legal certifications covering one wall like victory banners. "Let me predict," she said after I'd presented my situation, "they're claiming emergency authorities that don't exist in your actual governing documents." Jennifer's first discovery elevated my blood pressure dangerously. The HOA's emergency management authority was complete fantasy. She'd invested 20 minutes with our community's actual governing documents and found precisely 0 references to emergency property oversight, temporary management, or any authority that would permit Patricia to operate businesses from my house. Her second discovery was even more satisfying. The board had never authorized such authority. No meeting records, no resolutions, no documentation of any kind. The power Patricia claimed was as legitimate as unicorns, but apparently more lucrative. The third discovery made me want to bronze Jennifer's law degree. Patricia had been collecting oversight fees from other homeowners for 4 years with absolutely no legal foundation. She'd essentially been operating an extortion scheme with official letterhead and legal terminology. While Jennifer developed the legal strategy, Patricia initiated her counteroffensive with the subtlety of a military bombardment. Wednesday morning delivered an anonymous report to the city planning department claiming my home office violated commercial zoning restrictions. The inspector appeared while I was at a client presentation, but my security cameras, freshly installed and concealed better than government surveillance, captured everything. The official spent 30 minutes examining my property with someone who clearly understood the layout intimately, someone who indicated exactly which windows belonged to my office and where the electrical installations were located. The inspector discovered nothing problematic because there was nothing problematic to discover. But as he departed, he mentioned to my neighbor Carol that whoever submitted the complaint possessed detailed knowledge of my house's internal configuration. I wonder who that could have been. Thursday brought another anonymous complaint, this time alleging I was operating a commercial enterprise from residential property in violation of municipal zoning regulations. Identical pattern, someone with comprehensive knowledge of my work arrangement, someone who understood exactly what equipment I possessed and where I maintained it. Friday delivered the social media offensive. Neighborhood social platforms began featuring posts about the problematic new resident who was creating difficulties for established community members. The gossip campaign portrayed me as everything from a tax fraud to someone probably concealing assets from my business partnership dissolution. My daughter Emma returned from school asking why neighbors were questioning her about my activities and whether I was facing some kind of legal trouble. Saturday was when Michael's law enforcement colleagues began their intimidation campaign. Suddenly, patrol vehicles started cruising my street with the frequency of food delivery during major sporting events. They'd decelerate in front of my residence, sometimes stopping to investigate things that required no investigation. The message was transparent. We're monitoring you. But Sunday was when I retaliated with the nuclear option of the information age: data recovery. My background in cybersecurity had taught me that most people delete files like they discard newspapers. They assume it's eliminated, but it's really just concealed. Patricia had been cautious to avoid using my computer directly, but she'd underestimated cloud synchronization systems and automatic backups. My home security footage told a story worthy of a thriller novel: 12 days of Patricia entering and exiting my house like she possessed ownership rights, bringing guests, including what appeared to be prospective real estate clients for property tours, utilizing my pool, my kitchen, hosting what seemed to be professional networking events in my entertaining spaces. The most incriminating footage showed her systematically photographing my home's interior room by room, with professional lighting equipment. She wasn't just squatting, she was documenting my house for commercial purposes. But the digital evidence was even more devastating. Hidden in my computer's temporary files were traces of attempted access and cached data from her device when it connected to my wireless network. She'd tried to breach my personal files, my financial records, my client information. The attempts failed due to encryption, but the digital evidence was preserved like breadcrumbs leading directly to her device's unique identifier. Jennifer Walsh's response to this evidence was the most beautiful sound I'd heard since my daughter's first words. We're going to annihilate her in court. By Monday, the neighborhood dynamic had shifted. Carol organized an informal discussion group in her patio, ostensibly to address community concerns. 11 households participated, and by the conclusion of 3 hours, we'd revealed a pattern of harassment and intimidation extending back years. Mrs. Davidson from Oak Lane had paid $1,200 in fraudulent maintenance compliance fees. The Chen family had been pressured into using Patricia as their real estate representative when they'd considered relocating. Even reserved Mr. Thompson admitted he'd received citations for violations he was certain other neighbors committed without consequences. The discussion group concluded with something I hadn't anticipated: unity. For the first time since inheriting my uncle's house, I realized I wasn't fighting this battle alone. But as we learned Tuesday morning, Patricia wasn't finished with her arsenal of underhanded tactics. Not remotely. Tuesday morning brought the type of revelation that changes everything. Jennifer Walsh called at 7:30 a.m., with the tone attorneys use when they've discovered the treasure. David, we obtained the court order for HOA financial records. You need to examine this immediately. I drove to her office, still wearing my exercise clothes, gripping a travel mug of coffee like a lifeline. Jennifer had spreadsheets covering her conference table like military strategies, and her expression combined triumph with revulsion. Your friend Patricia has been extremely busy, she said, indicating highlighted rows of figures. We found $62,000 in payments to vendors that don't exist. The system was elegant in its simplicity: emergency repairs during storms that never occurred, landscaping services for areas that were never touched, security upgrades for equipment that was never installed. Every invoice was professionally formatted, every amount carefully calculated to avoid thresholds requiring board approval. But here's where my cybersecurity background became priceless. While Jennifer analyzed the legal implications, I traced the digital financial trail. Every fraudulent vendor payment had been deposited into accounts connected to Thornfield Property Services, LLC, a company that existed only digitally and in Patricia's banking records. She's been systematically stealing from the entire community, I said, calculating the totals. But there's something more significant here. That's when Jennifer showed me the file that made everything connect. Hidden in my home office documents, the ones Patricia had clearly examined, we found her business proposal for Thornfield Elite Property Management. The document read like a criminal blueprint disguised as corporate planning. Her strategy explicitly detailed using temporarily vacant luxury homes as demonstration properties for high-end real estate clients. She hadn't just been squatting in my house for convenience. She'd been executing a sophisticated fraud scheme using my inherited mansion as her personal showroom to impress wealthy prospects. The networking events, the professional photography, the touring potential clients through my home, it was all components of a plan to present herself as managing luxury properties she couldn't afford. The email correspondence we discovered was even more damaging. Communications between Patricia and something called Premier Property Solutions showed they'd been sharing profits from unauthorized use of vacant homes across 4 different counties. My house wasn't her first operation, it was just her most ambitious target. But the ultimate revelation came when we found her expansion plan. Buried in the files was a purchase contract template pre-completed with my property address and a sale price $250,000 below market value. She'd been preparing to claim legal authority over my house through some kind of emergency lien procedure, essentially stealing my inheritance through legal documentation and administrative manipulation. My neighbor Carol's forensic accounting expertise, something she'd modestly failed to mention during our discussion groups, proved invaluable. She'd spent her career investigating corporate fraud, and Patricia's schemes were textbook examples of embezzlement and property fraud. The total theft across all communities probably exceeds $300,000, Carol explained that evening as we sat in my kitchen, documents spread across the table like evidence in a war crimes investigation. She's been targeting vacant properties, elderly homeowners, and anyone too intimidated to resist. The scope was staggering. 8 different HOA communities, dozens of victims, years of systematic fraud. My case wasn't just about someone squatting in my house, it was about dismantling a criminal enterprise that had been operating under the cover of community service. That night, as I sat in my reclaimed living room, the components of Patricia's operation became crystal clear. She wasn't just a petty dictator intoxicated by HOA power, she was a professional criminal who discovered how to monetize homeowner intimidation. The violation of my home suddenly felt less personal and more calculated. I hadn't been randomly targeted, I'd been specifically selected because my inherited house represented the perfect combination of high value and vulnerable ownership. A divorced man dealing with a recent inheritance, still learning the community dynamics, temporarily absent for international business travel. But she'd made one critical miscalculation. She'd targeted someone with the technical expertise to trace her digital footprint, the financial resources to pursue legal action, and the stubborn determination to see it through to completion. As I secured my newly protected front door that night, I realized the real war was just beginning. We hadn't just discovered evidence of fraud. We'd uncovered a criminal conspiracy that extended far beyond my violated sanctuary, and tomorrow we were going to begin dismantling it systematically. Wednesday morning converted my kitchen into a command center that would impress military strategists. Jennifer Walsh arrived with legal documentation, Carol brought her forensic accounting resources, and I contributed enough coffee to power a small corporation. The aroma of fresh determination mixed with the scent of legal markers as we planned our multifaceted assault on Patricia's criminal empire. Jennifer outlined our legal strategy like a commander planning a major offensive. Civil litigation first, trespassing, fraud, breach of fiduciary duty, and defamation. Each charge carried specific penalties, but more importantly, civil discovery would force Patricia to produce documents she'd rather keep buried deeper than state secrets. "The FBI is engaged," Jennifer announced, sliding a business card across my granite counter. "Financial Crimes Unit wants to discuss the mail fraud angle. Every fraudulent HOA notice she sent constitutes federal mail fraud, and that carries substantial prison time." The State Real Estate Commission was equally interested in investigating unlicensed property management and misuse of client information. Apparently, using other people's homes as your personal showroom violates approximately 20 different professional standards. Carol's forensic accounting work had produced the smoking gun we required. Detailed financial records showing exactly how HOA funds had been diverted into Patricia's personal accounts. Years of fictitious invoices, phantom vendors, and emergency repairs that never materialized. The paper trail led directly to her doorstep like GPS for fraud detection. "Here's what most people don't understand about HOA law," Jennifer explained, indicating highlighted sections of our community bylaws. Emergency powers must be explicitly granted in writing. Any fees over $150 require majority board votes, and board members must disclose financial conflicts of interest or face personal liability. That last component was crucial. Every fee Patricia had imposed without proper board approval was legally meaningless. Every decision she'd made while concealing her real estate conflicts opened her to personal lawsuits, and every dollar she'd collected through fraudulent fees constituted theft, pure and simple. While Jennifer handled the legal bombardment, Carol and I organized the community mobilization effort. We scheduled a homeowner rights education session at the local community college, carefully framing it as educational rather than confrontational. The objective was to provide neighbors the knowledge they needed to recognize and resist HOA abuse without making it appear like a vendetta. 26 homeowners attended, drawn by word of mouth and genuine curiosity about their rights. What we discovered during that session was both heartbreaking and infuriating. 21 different families had been victimized somehow over the past 5 years. Mrs. Patterson from Elm Street had paid $2,800 in emergency maintenance fees for work that was never performed. The Martinez family had been cited 22 times for violations that identical behaviors by other neighbors somehow avoided. Even tough-minded contractor Bill Rodriguez admitted he'd paid fraudulent fees rather than challenge them because he didn't have time for HOA politics. The pattern was clear as my uncle's vintage crystal. Patricia systematically targeted anyone who couldn't or wouldn't fight back. New residents, elderly homeowners, single parents, people with language barriers, anyone who seemed vulnerable or distracted by life circumstances. By the conclusion of that session, we had something more powerful than legal documents, a unified community ready to demand accountability. The technical aspects of our evidence collection became my expertise. Every homeowner who'd been victimized received a comprehensive documentation template. Dates, amounts, witnesses, photographs, and copies of any correspondence. My cybersecurity background proved invaluable for organizing digital evidence and creating encrypted backups that even federal agencies would approve. We established a secure communication network using an encrypted group chat, partially for security and partially because it made everyone feel like they were part of a resistance movement, which in a way they were. The media strategy required careful coordination. I'd worked with investigative journalists during my corporate consulting days, and I understood the importance of providing them a complete narrative rather than fragmentary information. Local television news loves stories about authority figures abusing power, especially when there's visual evidence and sympathetic victims. Jennifer filed a motion to freeze Patricia's assets before she could conceal or transfer the stolen money. The legal mechanism was complex, but the principle was simple. You can't profit from crime while the crime is being prosecuted. Meanwhile, I began documenting everything for potential documentary purposes. The story contained all the elements that make people stop scrolling: corruption, abuse of power, ordinary people fighting back against injustice, and enough evidence to fill a small archive. But the psychological warfare was perhaps our most effective weapon. I began attending every board meeting with Jennifer present, politely requesting detailed financial documentation for every decision. My calm, professional demeanor contrasted sharply with Patricia's increasing agitation. "Could you explain the vendor selection process for this contractor?" I'd ask. "Where are the invoices for this emergency repair? What documentation supports this fee structure?" Each question was perfectly reasonable and completely legal. Each question also made Patricia visibly uncomfortable because each question had an answer she couldn't provide without admitting fraud. By Friday, we were prepared to launch our coordinated offensive. Legal papers were filed, federal investigators were briefed, media contacts were prepared, and the community was organized. Patricia had built her little empire on intimidation and ignorance. We were about to demonstrate that knowledge and solidarity make pretty effective weapons, too. Patricia's response to our organized resistance was swift, desperate, and absolutely predictable. By the following Monday, she'd filed a restraining order against me, claiming harassment, stalking, and threats. The petition read like fiction, complete with allegations that I'd been surveilling her house and intimidating her real estate clients with erratic behavior. The irony was substantial enough to serve at dinner. The woman who'd been operating a business from my house without permission was now claiming I was stalking her. The restraining order hearing was scheduled for Friday morning in the county courthouse, a building that carried the aroma of justice and institutional cleaning products. Patricia arrived with a discount attorney who looked like he'd obtained his degree from a correspondence course, while I appeared with Jennifer Walsh and a storage box full of evidence that could overwhelm a small library. Judge Robert Martinez had the no-nonsense demeanor of someone who'd heard every sob story and legal excuse imaginable. He listened to Patricia's tearful testimony about feeling threatened and unsafe with the patience of a saint and the skepticism of an experienced jurist. "Mr. Reed has been deliberately intimidating me at board meetings," Patricia claimed, dabbing her eyes with tissues that appeared conveniently from her purse. "He monitors my house, follows me around the neighborhood, and makes threatening comments about my business." Her performance deserved critical acclaim, complete with voice trembles and strategic emotional pauses. If I hadn't known she was fabricating everything, I might have felt sympathy for her. Then Jennifer stood up with our timeline and security footage. "Your Honor, we have documentation showing that Mr. Reed has never been within 1,000 feet of Ms. Thornfield's residence," Jennifer said, presenting printed screenshots from multiple security cameras. These timestamps correspond exactly with the dates she claims he was stalking her. The footage was devastating. While Patricia claimed I was lurking around her house on Wednesday evening, my security system showed me hosting Emma's study group in my kitchen. When she alleged I'd confronted her at the shopping center on Saturday, credit card receipts placed me at a client meeting 75 miles away. But the nuclear option came when Jennifer presented audio recordings from HOA board meetings. "Ms. Thornfield claims Mr. Reed has been threatening and aggressive," Jennifer told the judge. "These recordings from public meetings tell a different story. The audio was damning in its professionalism. Every question I'd asked was reasonable, every comment was courteous, every interaction was civil to the point of being tedious. Meanwhile, Patricia's voice on the recordings grew increasingly shrill and defensive as I'd requested basic financial documentation. Judge Martinez's expression shifted from neutral to irritated. "Ms. Thornfield, do you have any evidence beyond your testimony to support these stalking allegations?" Patricia's lawyer produced Michael's written statement supporting her claims about my aggressive behavior, but Jennifer was prepared for that too. "Your Honor, Detective Brennan was present in Mr. Reed's home without permission when this alleged aggressive behavior occurred. His statement fails to mention that he was there as Ms. Thornfield's guest, not in any official capacity. The judge denied the restraining order with the type of judicial irritation usually reserved for frivolous lawsuits and traffic violations. He also warned Patricia about filing false claims, which felt like an early holiday present wrapped in legal precedent. But Patricia's desperation was just gaining momentum. The next week brought a coordinated campaign of dirty tricks that would have impressed a political operative. Anonymous complaints to my business clients alleged I was under investigation for fraud and facing serious legal troubles. Fake online reviews appeared on my company's website claiming everything from incompetence to criminal behavior. Most disturbing was the attempt to involve Emma in her web of lies. My daughter returned from school upset because someone had contacted the administration claiming she was being neglected and left alone during my business trips. The school counselor, who'd known Emma for years, recognized the obvious fabrication, but the stress on my child was real and infuriating. Then came the Child Protective Services visit. A very serious social worker named Maria Santos appeared at my door on a Thursday evening, armed with a clipboard and a concerned expression. Someone had reported that I was frequently absent for business travel and leaving my teenage daughter unsupervised for extended periods. The complaint was so obviously false it bordered on absurdity. Emma was 16, honor student, varsity tennis player, and more responsible than most adults I knew. But I dutifully provided documentation of my parenting arrangements, emergency contacts, and Emma's academic and extracurricular achievements. Ms. Santos spent an hour touring our home, interviewing Emma, and reviewing our family situation. Her final report not only dismissed the complaint, but commended our stable home environment and Emma's exceptional maturity and academic performance. The false report backfired spectacularly, creating an official record of Patricia's harassment tactics while highlighting what responsible parenting looks like. Emma, bless her heart, was more amused than upset by the whole situation. "She really thinks she can intimidate us with fake complaints?" she asked that evening as we ordered Chinese food and celebrated the clean CPS report. "Doesn't she realize we have actual evidence and she has what exactly?" Smart kid. She'd inherited her great-uncle's practical wisdom along with his house, but while we were celebrating small victories, Patricia was preparing her most desperate gambit yet, and this time she was going to bring down the entire neighborhood association with her. Patricia's final act of desperation unfolded like a disaster movie in real time. Faced with mounting legal pressure and a community that was finally seeing through her schemes, she decided to burn down the entire system rather than face the consequences of her actions. It started with a mysterious technology failure. "I'm so sorry," she announced at the emergency board meeting she'd called for Thursday evening. "Our financial records have been completely lost. My computer system crashed over the weekend, and unfortunately our cloud backup failed too. The timing was about as suspicious as a lottery winner buying tickets with tomorrow's numbers. Just days before the court-ordered financial audit, every digital record of HOA transactions had mysteriously vanished into the electronic equivalent of the Bermuda Triangle. But Patricia had underestimated two things: my cybersecurity expertise and the fact that deleted doesn't actually mean deleted in the digital world. While she was performing her technological tragedy for the remaining board members, I was working with a data recovery specialist who owed me a favor from a previous corporate case. The beauty of modern computer systems is that they're terrible at actually erasing information. They just hide it and pretend it's gone. Within 72 hours, we'd recovered 91% of the lost financial records from her computer's hard drive, including browser history showing she'd researched how to permanently delete files and data destruction software the evening before her supposed crash. The recovered files revealed the full scope of her operation: email chains with fictitious vendors, detailed plans for property takeovers, and a spreadsheet tracking which homeowners were most likely to pay fraudulent fees without fighting back. She'd been running her scheme with the methodical precision of a Fortune 500 corporation, but the smoking gun was an email draft she'd never sent, complaining to her accomplice about that tech guy who thinks he's so clever. The draft outlined plans to destroy all evidence and make sure nobody can prove anything happened. While we were recovering her digital trail, Patricia launched her Scorched Earth campaign within the community. She called a special board meeting to vote on emergency assessments totaling $18,000 per household to cover unexpected maintenance costs and legal expenses. The assessments would have bankrupted half the elderly residents and forced young families to choose between their mortgages and HOA compliance. Her pitch to the 3 remaining board members who still believed her act was masterful manipulation. David Reed's vindictive lawsuit is costing our community thousands in legal fees. Every homeowner should pay equally for the damage his harassment has caused. She was essentially trying to make the entire neighborhood pay for her legal defense while positioning herself as the victim of my wealthy newcomer privilege. The meeting was set for Tuesday evening with minimal notice and maximum pressure tactics, but our community network was ready. 47 homeowners showed up to that meeting, a record attendance that turned the clubhouse into standing room only. The smell of tension mixed with Carol's homemade brownies, which she'd brought because confronting corruption works better on a full stomach. Elderly Elizabeth Hartwell, now fully awakened to Patricia's tactics, stood up with a voice that could have shattered glass. I moved to remove Patricia Thornfield from the board for financial misconduct and breach of fiduciary duty. The vote was swift and decisive, 4-1 to remove Patricia from her position, with only her brother-in-law Kenneth casting the dissenting vote. Kenneth himself was voted off the board 15 minutes later for failing to exercise proper oversight of financial irregularities. But Patricia's humiliation wasn't complete. As she gathered her papers and prepared to storm out, FBI Special Agent Lisa Chen walked through the clubhouse doors with the kind of presence that makes guilty people confess their sins immediately. "Ms. Thornfield," Agent Chen said, her voice carrying the authority of federal law enforcement. "We have a warrant for your arrest on charges of mail fraud, conspiracy, and violation of federal wire fraud statutes." The handcuffs clicked with the finality of justice served. As Patricia was led away, she made one last desperate attempt to maintain her victim narrative. "This is all because of him," she shouted, pointing at me. "He's destroyed our community with his lies and vindictive lawsuits." The 47 homeowners who'd gathered to witness her downfall remained silent as the FBI escorted her to their unmarked vehicle. The only sound was the evening breeze rustling through the maple trees that had watched over our neighborhood for decades before Patricia's reign of terror began. Emma, who'd been sitting quietly in the back row doing homework during the meeting, looked up from her chemistry and said, "Well, that was intense." The understatement of the decade, delivered with the dry humor she'd inherited from her great-uncle Harold. In the parking lot afterward, neighbors lingered longer than usual, as if nobody wanted to end this moment of collective vindication. Carol organized an impromptu celebration for the following weekend to mark new beginnings, and for the first time in months, people were genuinely excited about community activities. But as satisfying as Patricia's arrest was, the real victory was what happened next. A neighborhood that had been divided by fear and intimidation came together to rebuild something better than what they'd lost. 4 weeks later, the Willowbrook Gardens controversy had evolved beyond a neighborhood dispute into a full-blown municipal scandal. The city council called a special hearing on HOA reform legislation, and the packed auditorium felt like the scene of a political revolution conducted with parliamentary procedures and visitor badges. Every seat was occupied with residents, reporters, city officials, and curious observers who'd followed the story through local news coverage. The smell of nervous anticipation mixed with the institutional coffee that flows through government buildings like administrative lifeblood. I was scheduled to testify about the need for stronger HOA oversight laws, but Patricia had other plans. Despite being out on bail and facing federal charges, she'd convinced her new lawyer, a slick character who looked like he charged by the word, to let her make one final public relations offensive. Her strategy was classic narcissist playbook: position herself as the victim of a wealthy newcomer's vindictive harassment campaign. She took the podium first, wearing a black dress that probably cost more than most people's monthly car payments, and delivered a performance that deserved its own streaming special. "I've dedicated 6 years of my life to serving this community," she began, her voice trembling with practiced emotion. "I've volunteered countless hours, protected property values, and maintained the standards that make Willowbrook Gardens the desirable neighborhood it is today." The audience was initially quiet, some even appearing sympathetic to her plight. She'd always been skilled at manipulation, and this was her masterpiece performance. "Now I'm being targeted by a vindictive newcomer who couldn't accept reasonable community guidelines," she continued, building to her crescendo. "David Reed has used his wealth and connections to destroy my reputation, my business, and my life over simple misunderstandings about property management." Several people nodded along. Her victim narrative was compelling if you didn't know the facts, and she'd always been talented at making her fraud sound like community service. Then she made the mistake that destroyed everything. "I have never done anything illegal or unethical," she declared, her voice rising with righteous indignation. "Every action I took was to protect our community's interests and property values." That's when I stood up and asked the moderator for permission to present evidence. "Before we continue," I said, walking to the front of the room with my laptop and presentation remote, "I think everyone should see what Ms. Thornfield's property protection actually looked like." The first video clip appeared on the large screen behind the podium, security footage of Patricia hosting a business networking event in my dining room, complete with catered food and what appeared to be potential real estate clients touring my house. The auditorium fell silent except for the audio from my security system, Patricia's voice explaining to her guests about managing this exquisite property and the exclusive nature of our community's luxury homes. The second clip showed her examining my personal documents in my home office, photographing files with her phone. The third captured her coaching Michael on how to intimidate homeowners who ask too many questions about fees and violations. But the nuclear option was the recovered audio from her crashed computer, a phone conversation where she explicitly discussed using vacant homes as showcase properties for her real estate business, complete with her laughing about that tech guy who thinks he's so smart. The audience reaction shifted from sympathy to outrage in real time, like watching a political rally change directions mid-speech. Murmurs of disbelief turned into angry whispers, then open expressions of disgust. "Ladies and gentlemen," I said, advancing to the next slide showing financial records, "this is $127,000 in documented fraud across multiple HOA communities, emergency repairs that never happened, vendors that don't exist, and fees collected for services never provided." Detective Captain Sarah Williams, who'd been sitting quietly in the fourth row, stood up to address the crowd. "Ms. Thornfield is currently under federal indictment for mail fraud, wire fraud, conspiracy, and violation of federal racketeering statutes. The FBI investigation has identified victims across 8 different communities. Patricia's lawyer attempted damage control, but you can't unsee evidence or unhear recorded confessions." The crowd's mood had shifted from curious to hostile, and even her most loyal supporters looked like they'd been personally betrayed. City Councilwoman Maria Rodriguez took the microphone with the authority of someone who'd seen enough municipal scandals to last 3 lifetimes. "The legislation before us today will require monthly financial audits for all HOA boards, mandatory disclosure of conflicts of interest, and criminal background checks for community management positions." The vote was unanimous, 7-0 to pass the most comprehensive HOA reform legislation in the county's history. But the moment that made everything worthwhile came when elderly Mrs. Davidson, who'd paid $200 in fraudulent fees she couldn't afford, stood up in the back row. "I want to thank David Reed," she said, her voice carrying across the silent auditorium, for having the courage to fight back when the rest of us were too scared or too tired to resist. The standing ovation lasted 4 full minutes and felt like absolution for every sleepless night I'd spent wondering if the fight was worth it. As we filed out of the auditorium, Emma nudged me with her elbow. "Dad, I think Uncle Harold would be proud." She was right. He would have loved seeing justice served with such thorough documentation. 8 months later, justice had been served with the precision of a Swiss watch and the satisfaction of a perfectly executed revenge plot. Patricia pled guilty to avoid a trial that would have exposed even more victims and criminal associates. The federal judge sentenced her to 24 months in federal prison, 3 years of probation, and ordered her to pay $184,000 in restitution to all identified victims. Her real estate license was permanently revoked, and she was banned from serving on any HOA board in the state. Detective Michael Brennan received 8 months in county jail, lost his police pension, and was permanently barred from law enforcement. Watching a corrupt cop face consequences felt like finding a unicorn in your backyard. Rare, magical, and absolutely satisfying. The civil lawsuit settled for an additional $67,000 in punitive damages, money that went directly into establishing what became known as the Willowbrook Gardens Community Support Fund. The fund helps families facing temporary financial hardship with emergency home repairs, medical expenses, and other community support needs. Our new HOA board, which I somehow got elected to as secretary despite my protests, implemented the kind of transparency that would make government accountants weep with joy. Weekly financial reports, open bidding for all contracts, and monthly community meetings where actual neighbors discuss actual issues like civilized human beings. Property values in our neighborhood actually increased after Patricia's removal, partly due to improved management, and partly because buyers love communities with transparent governance. Turns out people prefer HOAs that protect property values through competent management rather than fear-based intimidation. The personal healing surprised me most. My house, which had felt violated and foreign for months, slowly became home again. Emma and I hosted our first annual neighborhood barbecue that fall, with over 70 neighbors attending. The sound of children playing on the swing set I'd installed exactly where Patricia used to park. Her unauthorized Mercedes felt like reclaiming sacred ground, but the ripple effects extended far beyond our neighborhood boundaries. David's Law, officially titled the Homeowner Protection and Financial Transparency Act, became model legislation adopted by 4 other states within 18 months. The law requires financial transparency, mandates conflicts of interest disclosure, and establishes clear procedures for challenging HOA decisions. I found myself testifying before the state legislature about HOA reform, speaking at homeowner rights conferences, and consulting with other communities facing similar corruption. My cybersecurity business actually grew from the publicity as potential clients were impressed by my methodical approach to fighting institutional fraud. The documentary When HOAs Attack, One Man's Fight for Justice premiered at the Regional Film Festival and won the Audience Choice Award. Emma was more excited about appearing in a documentary than about getting accepted to her first choice university, which tells you everything you need to know about teenage priorities. But the community transformation was the real victory. Carol established annual community rights workshops where residents learn about property law, HOA governance, and how to recognize abuse of authority. We created a neighborhood newsletter that actually contains useful information instead of violation citations. The Homeowner Legal Defense Scholarship we established helps law students provide free legal assistance to families fighting HOA abuse. Last year, they helped 16 families recover over $47,000 in fraudulent fees and fines. 3 years after Patricia's arrest, our annual block party has become the neighborhood event people actually look forward to rather than endure. This year's party drew over 150 attendees, including several families who'd been victimized by Patricia's schemes in other communities. As I stood in my backyard watching neighbors who'd been strangers become genuine friends, listening to children laugh instead of adults whisper about intimidation tactics, I thought about what my Uncle Harold always said: this house was meant to bring people together. He'd been right, just not in the way any of us expected. The smell of grilling steaks mixed with Carol's famous peach cobbler, while Emma and her friends provided a soundtrack of teenage laughter from the volleyball net we'd set up near the garden. For the first time since inheriting this beautiful house, it felt like the sanctuary my uncle had always intended it to be. If your HOA has ever pulled something shady, drop your story in the comments below. You'd be amazed how common this kind of abuse is, and how often victims think they're powerless to fight back. Trust me, you have more rights than you realize, and sometimes the bullies are the ones who are actually powerless when faced with organized, informed resistance. Hit that subscribe button if you want to hear how we helped 4 more families beat corrupt HOAs this year. Next week, I'll tell you about the city councilman who thought he could shut down a veteran's food truck with fake health violations until he discovered the veteran had been documenting everything for 8 months. Remember, documentation beats intimidation every single time. From all of us here at HOA Stories, thanks so much for watching today's HOA Karen Meltdown. If you enjoyed seeing neighbors stand their ground and karma catch up, smash that like button, leave a comment with your thoughts, and subscribe so you won't miss the next HOA drama we bring you.